Hey there, my name's Dart. This is Gongfu presented by Favorite Teaware. And what do we talk about? Well, Chinese style tea, teaware education, and teaware history. Today's topic is sizing up your teaware for the best tea experience. We want to know, should I go with little Jimmy over here or Big Gertrude? And how do I end up making sure that I don't have 100 pieces of teaware at home? Well, unless you want 100 pieces of teaware at home, in which case feel free to check out our website because we have a ton of awesome teaware for you to check out. But let's get right into it. And also make sure you stay with me till the end of the video because I have a really cool new Chinese chengyu, which is a Chinese idiom, and a really cool teacup term if you haven't heard of it before. It's the master or specialties cup. But we'll talk about that later. Let's start with pots. All right, so for pots, we're gonna start here and progress from smallest to largest in each of these categories. So for these, this could be any pot or brew cup. I just use pots today because I feel like they're a better representation and you can see how much bigger they actually get. So smallest are gonna be best for individual sessions, right? If you're just drinking by yourself. The mid-size obviously are gonna be more versatile. You can brew with a group or you can brew solo. And then these bigger pots, really you're only gonna wanna use them in a group setting. Now, before anybody asks or before you go looking for this pot, this is not a real pot. This is a tea pet that you can put on your table. It's not actual zini. It is from Yixing, but it is not actual zini. I have a funny story about that later. So one thing we're gonna talk about when we're looking at our teaware, first of all, everything is gonna be in milliliters, so sorry, bear with me on that. But more importantly than that is we need to talk about the actual fill level with each of the types of teaware that we talk about today. Because when there's a capacity listed, we need to know, is that to the rim or is that the recommended? Because each tea and teaware company is gonna have a different recommendation. And there are some standards in China for it, but a lot of times it's personal recommendation. So we wanna talk about that. So the fill percentage that we're gonna recommend here on a pot is gonna be 90 to 95%. And so the reason for that is we want it to be below this rim. This actually has a really nice gallery seating, but we want it to be below the rim so that we can brew with a dry setup. Now, what does a dry setup mean? Well, this, what I have right here would be a dry setup. I don't have anything to catch the water of my teaware if it spills over. This tea boat, for example, if I were to put it underneath this pot, that would make for a nice wet setup. Or you can get a bigger tea boat as well. But really with dry setups, you don't want to be doing a lot of spilling, and so you don't want it to pour over the side. Traditionally, there are a lot of places in China that would say, hey, you want to fill up the pot all the way, and you also actually want to pour the boiling water over the top of the pot to help warm up the pot and get it ready. That being said, we just think that wet setups they're just a little bit cumbersome, so we like to stick to a dry setup. So our recommendations are actually not going to be to fill it to the brim, but to that again, 90%, most of the way, just below where you get to where the pot is seated, which again is where the lid meets the body of the pot. To contrast what I just said about the pots, these we're gonna fill again to roughly 90%. Our brew cups, on the other hand, we found out you're only gonna fill to about 80%. You basically wanna go to just before where the lid meets the body. Or in cases that it flares out really towards the top, you want to get to right before it starts to open up. And that's gonna make sure that you don't burn your fingers when you're grabbing the brew cup. Even though you could fill it all the way to the top, you'll probably burn your hand. And so you wanna make sure that it's low enough that you don't burn your hand on it. So again, on a brew cup, we'd recommend about 80% of the total capacity is where you're gonna wanna fill it in most cases. All right, so let's get into sizing up the pot. So for our small pots, we're gonna wanna keep this smaller than 100 milliliters. Now this one is 40 millimeters if you fill it up all the way, but we'd recommend somewhere in the 37 or 36 milliliter so that you don't get any spillover again. It's funny though, because in the West, we see a lot of people, and when we went to Yixing and we sent these pictures, we kind of sent them as a joke, but people absolutely love them. They love these tiny, tiny little pots. And the funny thing is, when you're in Yixing, they don't have a ton of these. They have some, they exist, but there are a lot of pots that are 300, 400, 500 milliliters. But in the West, most people are looking for these sub 100 milliliter pots, which is just, it's interesting. I think a big part of it is because of trade and what we've had access to over time. It kind of makes sense, right? Because the smaller it is, the easier it is to ship. And the craftsmanship, well, it doesn't go down just because the pot is smaller. Additionally, if you get really, really small, the amount of skill and difficulty goes up. And I think there's there's some appeal for people there because of that factor as well. For a medium-sized pot, we're gonna recommend, again, a 1 or 200 milliliter pot. And this is gonna be very versatile, again, good for a solo or a group setting. For a medium size, we're gonna recommend something like this. This is between 100 and 200 milliliters is what we're looking for on this. This actual pot itself is 205 milliliters if you fill it all the way, but we would recommend 190 milliliters. Each of these pots are gonna be slightly different, and it's not going to be exactly 90%, but we want to make sure that we have a baseline for you to look up to. Again, these are going to be great for both solo sessions and brewing with other people. However, if you're brewing by yourself, you definitely want to make sure that you have a pour cup to go with it, because otherwise you're not going to be able to fit everything in the one cup when you're drinking, and then you're going to oversteep your tea. So you can either pour directly into the cup and then the rest into the pour cup, or you can pour into the pour cup and then after that pour the rest into your cup. Now for the large size. This we're looking at 200 milliliters or greater, which again is ironic because when we went to Yixing, we found a ton of pots that were 300, 400, 500 milliliters. But for the practical application in terms of what we see in the size of pour cups and pots, this just makes the most sense for what we actually see and functionally use in the West. So again, 200 milliliters or greater. This is 295 milliliters filled all the way, and we would recommend you take off about 10 milliliters to fill it to 285. This one again has a nice gallery seating in it, so it kind of tells you a little bit more. Here, let me actually show you the difference. You see how this one has a lip when it goes down and this one doesn't? If you fill to the bottom of that second lip, that's going to be perfect. And so that's why you don't have to take off as much. This is top seated, and so you actually have to go down a little bit more because when you get to this part on the rim, this pushes down into the pot. And when that pushes down, that's going to cause more water to come out. So again, 285 milliliters recommended, 295 completely full. Now, one thing that I want to make sure that everyone gets when we're talking about this size teapot is you need to make sure you're adding more tea. With these two, you can kind of get away with it. If you know what you're doing, you can maybe steep over a little bit because again, these are closer in size. But when we're talking about a large pot versus even a smaller size medium pot, you're maybe 2 or 3 times the size. And so when you're getting that big, you want to make sure you're sticking to that 5 grams every 100 milliliters roughly. So if you're going to put 5 grams in this, maybe you put 7 or 8 in this, you want to be putting 10 or more grams in a larger pot to make sure you're getting the same potency and you're getting all that you can out of the tea. And again, this is really only going to be for group sessions, but you just need to factor that in when you're steeping for other people that you're going to want to add more tea to this pot. Otherwise, it's not going to perform. Next, we have pour cups. If you don't know what a pour cup is, we use these as decanters between a pot and a cup. Because in Gongfu style drinking, we're using so many more leaves, the tea is much more potent. And if you don't remove the tea at the right time, you're going to get that bitter astringency and overbrew it. So we use these to help mild that out. First, we have the small size. And for small, again, we would recommend 150 milliliters or less. This guy is only about 115 when you fill it up. One nice thing about these two pour cups specifically, these are both from Jing Dejian, and you can see how it goes in and there's that little indent. That's a good indication of where you don't want to fill above. Again, with pour cups, we want to stay at that 70% or less. And again, it's for the same reason that we'd see in a brew cup is if there's tea here, you may burn yourself. So if you put it lower than that, then you don't have to worry about it. For the medium size, we're looking between 150 and 200 milliliters. This full is 180 milliliters, and we would recommend 145. So again, around 70%. And then for our large, we're going to say it's over 200 milliliters like this beautiful pour cup here, with this total being 250 and the recommended at 230 milliliters. Now, this has the most utility, right? It's glass, you can see through it, it's cheap, it's very accessible. These are more expensive. These are handmade and more iconic pieces, more unique, more distinct. But this is really going to be your best bet in terms of wanting to be able to see your teaware. However, if you're looking for that beautiful pour from 3 feet up, these two are going to get you there. Lastly, today we have cups. So for our cups, we have our small, which is going to be less than 80 milliliters, like this one, which is 50 milliliters full and 35 millimeters. For a medium recommendation, we're going to say 100 milliliters or less. And this one is actually 110 milliliters full, but we would recommend closer to 60. And then for large, for the cups, it's going to be 150 milliliters or greater. Now, one thing if you may have noticed, with the pots and the pour cups, those sizes line up almost exactly. With the sizing on the cups, it's not an exact science. science. And there's a good reason for that. There's a lot more fluidity and different terms used in tea culture for different sized teacups. This is actually a Korean style bowl, and in Chinese teaware, you often won't see a large cup like this one. But in China, what we will see is the distinguishing between a cha bei and a cha wan. And so let's talk about that now. So a cha bei literally means tea cup. A cha wan means tea bowl. And so roughly the size that we're going to see is over 100 milliliters is when we start to get into cha wans, into the tea bowl. And the style and the artistry typically picks up when we're looking at these. This is when we get into those two terms that I was talking about in the beginning of the video. For the cha beis, we have what's called a pingmen bei, which means a sipping cup. And then for the cha wan, there's a subvariant called the zhuren bei. This is translated often literally as master's cup, but I think more accurately as a specialty cup. Typically, this would be a one-off, one-of-a-kind, handmade piece that you would bring with you from tea house to tea house when you're traveling, when you're going over to your friend's house, and you basically keep this teacup on your person, or tea bowl on your person. Whereas the teacups, they'll often be a set and somebody else will provide those to you. Now, I didn't talk about the fill size when I talked about the cups, and there's a reason for that, and we're going to talk about that now. So most of our recommendations are about 70% on teacups. However, there is an important distinction that's made in Chinese culture when we're talking about tea. And this is definitely going to be a difference between Eastern and Western culture. And while we're talking about Gongfu tea, which is Eastern, we're also applying it in the West where people are drinking it. And so there's a merging and a bringing together of two different cultures in that. 70% is a lot of times what we would recommend for not wanting to fill up higher than, but there's actually a very, very specific saying to tell you how much to fill your teacups. And that is 酒倒满, 茶倒半. Now, what does this mean? 酒 is alcohol, 倒 is what we're talking about filling, and 满 means filled. 茶, tea, 倒, fill, 半, half. So when we're talking about these, basically what the saying is, if you're drinking alcohol, fill the cup all the way, but if you're drinking tea, fill it only half. This is something that we can all learn a little bit from when we're drinking Gongfu tea. The goal is not to fill it up all the way. The goal is to create an experience, and that experience comes from drinking less tea, but being more attentive to the tea. Thanks for sticking with me and talking about different sizes of teaware. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up and I will be happy to answer them. Other than that, have a great rest of your day. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button for us or subscribe. You already had to hit the button with your kettle.